China versus Europe. Two places with thousands of years of history, two of the most influential regions in the world, two very different ideas of what the future should look like. Living here in Germany, I thought I knew what a modern country was like. Then I went back to China, and I started noticing just how differently these two parts of the world have approached the idea of what a modern country should look like. In some ways, China felt years, even decades ahead of anything I'd experienced in Europe. But then there were other things where I thought, yeah, there's probably a reason Europe hasn't gone down this road. Because the more time I spent in China, the less it felt like a simple question of which country is more advanced. It became more a question of what you're actually willing to trade for that convenience, and what makes a place a good place to be. I was raised in the United States, but I've spent over 10 years living in Europe, mostly here in Germany. So I've dealt a lot with the bureaucracy here. Rented apartments, German banks, doctors, government offices, the Deutsche Bahn. And I've also spent a lot of time traveling and living elsewhere in Europe. So when I went back to China, I wasn't comparing it to some idealized version of Europe. I was comparing it to the places I'd actually spent years traveling and living in. And that is important, because when you visit a place for a week or a month, you notice the obvious stuff, like giant buildings or high-speed trains, the insane amount of technology everywhere. And that's my perspective when it comes to China. I just haven't lived there for years, so my scope is more limited. But spending a week or a year in a place, the same thing still can happen. When you actually start paying attention to how people live, that's when a comparison like this gets interesting. Because China and Europe have come up with some very different solutions to what is basically the same problem. How do you make everyday life work? And honestly, China can feel like it's living in the future sometimes. But it's only in Berlin that you're going to find the Futurium. So we've got that going for us here. But one of the very first things you notice in China is that your phone is basically connected to everything. You can pay with it, order food with it, call a taxi, get on public transportation, book things, buy things. It's not just something you use to do these things, it's kind of the thing that everything else revolves around. But that can also be problematic. If your entire life is built around your phone, you really don't want to arrive in the country and find out that your phone doesn't really work the way you're used to. I mean, I've gotten so used to traveling around Europe that I basically don't think much about this anymore. I'll drive or take a train from Germany into France, or fly from Germany to Spain, and that's it. I rarely even need to show my ID to enter a new country. I get where I'm going and my phone just connects to the network. I really don't even think about it. China is a very different situation. You arrive and suddenly you're dealing with a bunch of services you're used to using that either don't work or work very differently there. First off, when you enter China, you definitely know you've entered another country. Unlike travel within much of Europe, you're going through immigration and document checks. And what's funny about that is that China is one of the most digitally integrated countries I've ever visited. Once you're actually inside the system, everything is convenient. But as a foreigner coming in from outside that system, the first thing you've got to figure out is how to get connected. Let's put it this way. In Germany, if I forget my wallet, it might be an issue. In China, if I forget my phone, I'm stuck. Everything from paying for lunch to ordering a taxi to getting on public transportation is tied to that one device. But there's a catch for us visiting from the West. A lot of apps and services we're used to using just are not available on the Chinese internet. When it comes to the internet, Google, YouTube, Instagram, and many more websites and apps are restricted. If you're used to just pulling out your phone and looking something up whenever you need it, that's a pretty big adjustment. So even if you are connected, you're still entering a completely different digital world. Arriving in China means I need to think about connectivity again. In the European Union, my phone plan works the same in other countries as it does back in Germany, which makes jumping across borders here in Europe incredibly easy. But traveling in China, that's a whole different story entirely. And one of the biggest hurdles as a foreigner can be just trying to get your phone to work. That's why I'm excited to partner with today's sponsor, Airalo. If you've ever arrived in China, you know that trying to buy a physical SIM card as a foreigner can be a massive hassle with all the registration requirements. And even if you do get local data, you immediately hit the local internet restrictions. That means no Google Maps, no YouTube, no Instagram. A lot of the stuff you normally do online isn't possible, at least without the right tools. That is exactly why I recommend Airalo. There's no physical SIM card needed. You just install their app to download a digital SIM card right to your phone in a matter of seconds. You can use Airalo to stay seamlessly connected on your travels, and the beauty of it is that before you even board a flight to China, or anywhere else for that matter, you can have it completely set up. The second your plane lands, you simply turn on your phone and have instant connectivity. But the best part? Using an Airalo eSIM in China actually bypasses the local firewall restrictions. That means you can open up Google Maps to navigate to your hotel, or jump on Instagram to message your family and let them know you got in okay, just like you would anywhere else. Whether you need data for a single country, a whole region, or global coverage, Airalo has affordable plans for over 200 destinations starting at just a few dollars. Airalo eSIMs are an excellent way to save yourself stress, time, and roaming fees. So download the Airalo app using the link in the description and use my code DAVIDG to get an extra $3 off on your first eSIM. Knowing your phone will just work takes so much stress out of arriving in a new place. Speaking of which, let's get back to how China feels fundamentally different from Europe. Because once you're actually connected, that's where China starts getting really interesting. One of the first things that struck me there is just how much of daily life is built around a few apps. In China, you can have WeChat or Alipay on your phone and use it for a ridiculous number of different things. You can pay for basically anything, order food, call a taxi, book a hotel, buy train tickets, pay bills, make appointments. There's just this whole ecosystem built around your phone. And it's not necessarily that Germany doesn't have these things, it's that in Germany they're much more fragmented. You've got one app for this, another website for that, maybe you need a physical card for something else, and there's even the thing where you still have to print something out and mail it to somebody. People even still use fax machines here. After living somewhere for around a decade, you don't really notice how weird that is anymore, you just get used to it. But when you visit a place where so much of this has been put into one single digital system, you start to think about it again. Also, just keep in mind I'm focusing a lot on Germany here. I'm not saying that every country in the European Union is exactly the same. Denmark or Estonia, for example, are much more digitalized, and you can definitely notice differences between European countries. But I honestly don't think anywhere in Europe has everything centralized and digitalized in the way that China does. I'm not just talking about paying for things here either. The same thing applies to getting stuff done. If you want something delivered in China, there are entire ecosystems built around getting you basically anything you want incredibly quickly. Food, groceries, maybe medicine, random things you probably didn't even realize you could have delivered. And you can do this at times when in Germany you'd be looking at the clock thinking, that's just not gonna happen today. Generally here in Europe, opening hours are more limited. But Germany takes that to the next level. Most of the stores here close relatively early, like 7 p.m. early. Plus, Sundays are still a very big deal here. By law, most businesses must stay closed all day. And again, I'm not necessarily saying one place is better than the other. There's something quite nice about knowing that Sunday is Sunday and people aren't expected to work constantly just because someone wants to order a pair of socks at 11:30 at night. But if it's your only day off that week and you need some groceries, you're out of luck. If we're talking purely about convenience, China wins. And you see the same kind of thing with transportation. China has built the largest high-speed rail network in the world, and when you're actually using it, it can feel almost absurdly efficient. You get to the station, you get on the train, and move incredibly quickly between two places. And even within Chinese cities, the subway systems can be enormous, modern, clean, and incredibly easy to use. If we're comparing globally, Germany has good public transportation too. But anyone who's spent enough time here knows that good and reliable aren't necessarily the same thing. I've spent years dealing with German trains, the Deutsche Bahn. There are times when everything works just like it should. I mean, the trains aren't necessarily clean and the bathroom might be out of service, but they get you there close to on time. But then there are those times when you're standing at the platform looking at a message saying your train is delayed for hours and you have absolutely no idea what you're supposed to do next. I wish I could say that the rest of Europe is different, but outside of Switzerland and a few other countries, I don't really think it is. And that's really one of the biggest differences I've noticed between China and Europe. China seems to have optimized a lot of daily life around reducing friction. Whatever you want to do, get some food, hop on the train, it's all in your phone. And then you compare that to Europe, where sometimes the biggest challenge isn't actually doing something, but rather figuring out which system you're supposed to use to do it. In China, at least based on what people who actually live there have told me, most things can be handled digitally. Germany, on the other hand, still has plenty of situations where you need an appointment, a physical document, a signature, a letter in the mail. Sure, the Deutsche Bahn has an app where you can buy train tickets in Germany, but you definitely won't find yourself using that same app to make an appointment with a doctor or for a government service here. You'll often even need to call someone just to set up an appointment that you'll have to show up to in person. And I'm really not kidding, some things here still require you to send a physical letter. I constantly find myself in situations here where I know there could be an easier way to do whatever I want to do. I've seen how it works in China and honestly plenty of other countries too. But the answer here in Germany is basically just no. I mean, former Chancellor Angela Merkel went viral on the internet for saying the internet is uncharted territory for us all in a speech. In 2013, tons of countries around the world were already deeply digitalized. So yeah, that mentality clearly still exists here. You make an appointment, you bring tons of paperwork, you wait, often without being given any concept of how long, and eventually someone stamps something somewhere. Just keep in mind, it's not the exact same situation throughout Europe, maybe not even the exact same situation around Germany, but it's a thing. And that's a really interesting part about comparing these two places. Because if you just look on the surface, you might say China is obviously more advanced. But I don't think it's quite that simple. There's a big difference. China hasn't just digitalized systems that already existed. In a lot of cases, the systems there were built entirely around the technology from the beginning. I mean, the year I was born, 1991, Germany's economy was over 4 times bigger than China's. Now China's economy is nearly 4 times bigger than Germany's. That's rapid growth. So Germany's basically trying to take a lot of older systems that it had invested in heavily and drag them into the digital age. That makes a huge difference to what everyday life actually feels like. So if the question is simply, where is it easier to get things done? Honestly, after spending time in both places, I think China has a significant advantage. Keep in mind, I haven't tried living there long term, so some of what I'm saying is just what I've heard from people who do live there. But really, that's only one part of the question. Being easier isn't necessarily the same thing as being better. So if China is easier to get things done in, the obvious next question is, do things actually feel more technologically advanced there? Honestly, as a traveler, this is where the difference is probably most obvious. You don't need to understand the Chinese economy or spend years living there to notice it. You can just walk around. Take something as simple as paying for things. During COVID, Europe did really start to embrace contactless payments. But years later, Germany is still one of those countries where cash is used pretty widely. There are still places here where you'll see a sign saying cash only. I've had so many situations where I had to just stop for a second and think, wait, do I actually have enough cash on me? In China, you can walk around for days, for weeks without thinking about cash at all. You just pull out your phone and scan a QR code to pay. And it's really not that people are doing some super futuristic thing every time they pay for something. It's more that the technology there has become so normal that you don't notice it anymore. And then there's something in China that's even harder to miss: the cars. If you spend any time walking around a major Chinese city, you see electric cars everywhere. And I'm not talking about a few Teslas or electric Volkswagens here and there. Chinese electric vehicles are just a normal thing to see on the street there now. And that was extra interesting for me to see because Germany has this enormous automotive industry. You've got companies like Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen, Porsche. The car isn't just a form of transportation in Germany, it's really a part of the country's identity. But then when I went to China, I was seeing these electric cars everywhere and some of the brands I had never even heard of. You see cars with these huge screens, advanced driver assistance systems, cameras everywhere, and features that can make a fairly normal European car feel a little old-fashioned. Germany has spent many decades building some of the best cars in the world. But the whole thing about it is that China has had a much shorter history in the global car industry. So basically it's the same as some of the other stuff we've talked about. Instead of having to protect decades of investment in old technology, Chinese manufacturers could basically say, okay, what's the next thing? You see that same mentality when you're traveling around the country, even when cars aren't involved. I mean, we could be talking about trains, cars, or whatever infrastructure, but coming from someone who spent years traveling around and living in Europe, this is one of the things that can make Europe feel surprisingly old. Don't get me wrong, Europe has fantastic public transportation in many places, but most of that infrastructure was built with a very different set of constraints. Most of the infrastructure here in Europe was built decades or even centuries ago, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's something I actually really love about it here. You get off a train in Germany or France and walk straight into a city where the buildings around you have been there for hundreds of years. You can take a train from one country to another and suddenly you're in a completely different culture, different language, different food, and completely different architecture. For me at least, that's actually one of the things that makes living in Europe so amazing, but China is different. Think about it this way, it's home to dozens of cities where much of the skyline appeared during your lifetime. You can see enormous new metro systems, massive train stations, new roads, new airports, and entire neighborhoods being built at a scale that's hard to imagine without seeing it firsthand. As a traveler, that can be very impressive to witness. Then there are the little things all over that make China feel ultra-modern. Stuff like delivery robots and automated stores. Technology is being used in a lot of places where in Germany you'd probably still have someone sitting behind a desk. And again, I'm not saying that either one of these is inherently better. Sometimes I actually prefer to deal with a person rather than a machine. But what really stuck with me is how willing China seems to be to ask, can we just automate this? In Europe, I think especially in Germany to be honest, the question often seems to be, but what happens to the process we've already built? And I think that's probably the biggest technological difference I've noticed. It's not necessarily that China has better technology in every single category. It's just that right now at least, China seems much more willing to change the way something works when new technology comes along. Germany is really good at refining things. Take the unique S-Bahn trains here in Berlin. They are constantly switching the newer models out with the old. Each model is pretty similar to the last, but there's always a little bit of modification. The most recent ones finally even feature light air conditioning for those ultra hot days that we're getting more and more of. Okay, and don't even get me started on air conditioning here in Europe, especially Northern Europe. The climates may differ, but to keep it simple, China is way ahead there. In part, that's probably related to what we just talked about. An old 1980s building in China probably wasn't designed with air conditioning in mind. So why not just knock it down and build a brand new one with air conditioning installed? When you're traveling through China, you see the result of that everywhere. But I've got to be completely honest in the next part of this video. If you asked me where I'd prefer to travel today, China or Europe, I think I'd probably go with China. A big part of that is something we haven't addressed quite yet. China is really cheap to visit right now. It can be incredibly good value for a traveler. You can eat really well without spending much money, getting around is also affordable, hotels can be surprisingly cheap for what you get, and once you're actually inside the country and have figured out how everything works, you can cover enormous distances without spending a fortune. Compare that with a lot of Europe. It's not necessarily expensive everywhere here. But if you're traveling through some of the more popular destinations here, especially during peak season, the costs will add up quickly. Somehow, a trip within Europe always seems to cost just a little more than I expected it to. And that's especially true when I don't plan everything rigidly many months ahead. China gives you this really unusual combination of scale, convenience, and relatively low cost. As a Western visitor, I can't really speak to what it's like to earn wages in China. But you could be in Shanghai one day, take a high-speed train somewhere completely different, eat an amazing meal for a few dollars, stay somewhere really nice without spending a fortune, and then keep on keeping on. And one thing I really like, outside of super peak seasons, you can usually plan pretty spontaneously and still keep it affordable there. Then there's also the sheer scale of the country. Most countries wouldn't really make sense to compare to an entire continent like I'm doing here. But to put it into context, the European Union is about half the size of China geographically. It's just enormous, in terms of both geography and population. So even within one country, you can get incredibly different experiences. Big futuristic cities, historic cities, mountains, rural areas, coastlines, different languages, and different regional cuisines. I've really only seen a tiny fraction of the country and can already say the variety is almost unparalleled in the world. And because the transportation infrastructure is so good, it's not hard to connect to most places. But Europe has something China can't really compete with. Something you can't really find anywhere else. The variety of countries. I've spent years traveling around Europe, and it's pretty crazy when you think about it. I can get in a car in Germany, drive for a few hours, and suddenly I'm in France. Keep going and I'm in Belgium. Take a short flight and I'm in Spain. Go somewhere else and I'm in Italy, Greece, Poland, Lithuania. This comparison isn't apples to apples exactly, but Europe has more countries than China has provinces. And the difference from country to country isn't just something small either. They're completely different cultures, languages, histories, and ways of doing things within close geographical proximity. And because of the European Union, and especially the Schengen area, you can cross many of these borders without even really noticing. So I think there's a kind of interesting trade-off here. China might be easier to travel around in once you're there. Europe might be easier to travel across freely. And then there's just the experience of being in these places. In China, in most cities, you can walk around late at night and there's still so much happening. Restaurants are busy, shopping malls and night markets are busy, people are just out. And I love that as a traveler because the day doesn't necessarily end at 6 or 7 p.m. You can land somewhere late, go out, and still feel like you're actually experiencing the city. In Southern Europe, I feel like this is a lot more common too. I mean, in Spain, dinner can start at like 10 p.m. and the fiesta in the street can continue on till much later. But in Germany, and really most of Northern Europe, nighttime can be a very different experience. But that's kind of cool in its own way too. In Germany, we have what you could call the Feierabend mentality. Work is over, people go home, you sit in a beer garden, maybe go to a park. Work time is work time, and when it's over, it's really over. There is a very strong idea here that you're not meant to spend your entire life working. I rarely meet anyone here in Germany that will want to talk about work outside of work. I feel like there's definitely some value to that. It's pretty rare in the world. But on the flip side, that can also mean, okay, it's Sunday evening right now when I'm filming this video. I need something, but the grocery stores, they're not open. It will just have to wait until Monday. So I think that's where China has a real advantage to me as a traveler. It kind of feels like the country is designed around making things happen whenever you feel like making them happen. Actually, it feels pretty similar to my home country of the United States of America in that way. Need food at midnight? It's most likely a possibility. Need a taxi at 3 a.m.? Easy. Changed your mind about where you are at 1 a.m. and feel like going to another city? There's probably a train leaving soon. And when you're traveling, that kind of convenience makes all the difference. I mean, you're already often dealing with a place you don't really know. You don't necessarily want to spend half your day figuring out how to accomplish basic tasks. It's much easier if it's set up for you to figure out on the go. So, if I'm being honest, as a traveler, China won me over a little more than I expected it to. But there's one thing I absolutely would not ignore, because all of this convenience comes from somewhere. And once you start looking at how these systems actually work, there are some pretty significant trade-offs. This is probably the part of the comparison where you have to be, I don't know, most careful. It's very easy to look at China's technology and convenience and think, wow, why doesn't Europe do that? But there is a reason Europe is much more cautious about some of these things. Privacy. Germany takes data protection extremely seriously. Sometimes, honestly, probably too seriously. You can feel it in the bureaucracy, every company needs a privacy policy, every website asks for cookies, every time somebody wants to collect your information, there's another form to agree to. And sometimes, at least to me, it does feel completely ridiculous. But there's also a reason for that attitude. Germany has a very different historical relationship with government surveillance and personal data. But it does go beyond Germany and Europe too. Throughout the European Union, GDPR or General Data Protection Regulation applies, and it sets very strict rules protecting people's privacy. China has taken a very different approach. When so much of your life is connected to one single digital ecosystem, the system can also know enormous amounts about you. Where you go, what you buy, what services you use. It is all centralized there, and that can make the system incredibly convenient. But it also means you're giving up something in exchange. As a traveler, you notice another part of this immediately: information. In Germany, if I want to Google something, watch a YouTube video, look something up on Instagram, read an article from basically anywhere in the world, I generally don't have to think about whether the government here allows that particular service to operate. China's just a completely different environment. The Great Firewall means that a lot of the internet people in the West take for granted simply isn't available in the same way. And I think that's one of the biggest trade-offs in this entire comparison I'm making. You can build an incredibly sophisticated digital society while still putting significant limits on what information people can access. And those two things aren't necessarily contradictory. In fact, they're part of what makes China's system so interesting. It's extremely connected internally while being much more controlled externally. And then there's another difference that's harder to see when you're only visiting. Individualism. Germany is not exactly the most rebellious country on earth. There are plenty of rules and plenty of regulations. But there's also a pretty strong idea that the individual has certain rights that the government can't simply override because it would be more convenient.
5, 210, 215.
No, I'm not just talking about flying down the Autobahn either. China seems to place a lot more emphasis on collective outcome, social order, and stability. And again, I don't think any of the things we're talking about here are as simple as one is good and one is bad. There are advantages to both, and it's not absolute. Europe and China have many similarities too. But generally, a society with fewer restrictions can be messier, sometimes literally. A society with centralized control might be able to get things done very quickly. But the real question is basically, how much control are you actually comfortable with in exchange for efficiency? That's really what keeps coming back to mind throughout this whole comparison for me. Every time I've said China is more convenient, there's usually a reason for that. Every time I've said Germany is slower, there's usually a reason for that too. And sometimes those reasons are exactly the thing that makes one place feel better to live in. So after all of this, where would I actually want to live? This is honestly where the answer gets pretty simple for me. If I were just choosing a place to travel to right now, it would almost definitely be China. It's fascinating, people are welcoming, it's incredibly convenient, and can be very cheap. The transportation is amazing, there's so much to see there. And there's something really exciting about traveling to a country that's changing so quickly. But if you ask me where would I actually want to live long term, that's different. Honestly, I would still choose Europe. Not because it's more technologically advanced, not because it's more convenient, and definitely not because everything works better. There are plenty of things I've seen in China where I've thought, why can't we do this in Germany? Why can't we have this in the US? But I don't think I'd want to give up the things I value living in Europe just to get them. For me, the biggest one is freedom, at least my interpretation of the word. I grew up in the United States, I've spent most of my adult life in Europe, and I'm used to being able to access information freely, say what I want, travel relatively freely, and generally have a pretty strong sense of privacy and individual rights. I don't think I'd want to just straight up trade that for a more convenient life. That's probably the biggest takeaway for me from this particular comparison, Europe versus China. Nothing is black and white. Advanced doesn't necessarily mean better, and old doesn't necessarily mean broken. Germany has some systems that are genuinely frustrating. Sometimes they're absurdly slow, sometimes they feel like they were designed before the internet existed, because they often were. But some of that friction exists because Germany has chosen to put limits on what governments, companies, and institutions can do. To be fair, not all of it, and this does vary quite a bit around Europe. But within the European Union at least, I'd say the basic philosophy is about the same. China has made different choices. And those choices have allowed it to build a society that in many ways feels incredibly futuristic. But there's always a trade-off. And I think that's kind of what I missed when I initially started thinking about these comparison videos. I went to China and saw all the things that work better there. It's hard not to compare that back to places you're familiar with. And I've now got a few videos comparing China to other places and countries I know well too, so you can check those out next. But as for Europe and China, after spending a lot of time thinking about it, I realized the better question isn't why can't Europe or even the US be more like China? It's which part of China's approach would you actually want Europe to adopt? My answer is quite a lot of them. Better digital services, better public transportation, fewer ridiculous bureaucratic processes. I'd love to be able to do more things from my phone or computer without having to print something, sign it, and send it somewhere. But I don't want to give up on the things that I value about living in Europe just to get them. So if you forced me to choose, I honestly love both of these places, but I'd travel to China and stay living in Europe. Maybe that's the biggest thing I learned from going back to China. It showed me what the future can look like. But after 10 years in Europe, I think I've also learned that the future isn't just about making everything faster and easier. It's about deciding what you don't want to lose along the way.